thanks for Can TV for coming here to film all of this. I would like to begin first by saying hi for those of you who haven't been with us for a while. I'm Mark Canuel, the new-ish director of the Institute for the Humanities. I'm going to stop saying that after a couple more times because I won't be newish anymore. Just a couple of announcements to make before we really get going. In the next couple of weeks, we have quite a few exciting events, and I'd like you to mark your calendars, either now or later. Our next Fellows Lecture will be Will Small, speaking on November 14th on practical abilities in human agency. And before that, we're going to have our first in what I hope is going to be a series of what we're calling flash conferences on topics of urgent national and maybe even international debate. This one on the Confederate monuments controversy, and that will be on October 24th at 12 noon. We'll be serving yummy refreshments. Please come and join us for that. On November 3rd and 4th, we'll be having our Political Ecology as Practice conference featuring Bruno Latour and many other amazing scholars. And on November 8th, we'll be having our 100th anniversary celebration of Gwendolyn Brooks's poetry. And I hope that you will join us for that. Please just visit our website to get details on all of those things. What do we call? Like us on Facebook? Isn't that how don't you like people on Facebook and then you can't get rid of them? And also please follow us on Twitter. Follow us on Twitter because I've become absolutely mad on Twitter. And I was even talking to an undergraduate about Snapchat, so who knows what's going to come next. I would like to now talk to you. First, welcome to the Institute. Thank you so much for coming. I'm pleased to introduce Roderick Ferguson today for his Faculty Fellows Lecture based on the work he's doing at the Institute for the Humanities this year. Now I'm going to admit something here that will be of perhaps some embarrassment to Rod and definitely of some embarrassment to me, which is that I was one of his super fans long before he came to UIC, and I've told him that before. And so I was particularly happy when he joined us in 2014 in the departments of African American Studies and Gender and Women's Studies. Before coming to UIC, he taught at the University of Minnesota, where he served as chair of the Department of American Studies during that time that he was there. And he's also been a visiting professor at Princeton in 2013. He received his BA from Howard University in sociology and his MA and PhD in sociology from the University of San Diego, University of California at San Diego. Now, I mentioned the sociology part not only to suggest an interesting line of connection between W.E.B. Du Bois and Roderick, who, Du Bois also had that background, but also to signal the way that Professor Ferguson's work does traverse over a range of fields: English and American literature, philosophy, politics, history, sociology, just to name a few. And this, for me, is one of the reasons why I've appreciated his writing for quite some time. He shows us the virtues of thinking big, reaching out to texts and issues that influence multiple domains in the humanities, and I think it's for this reason that most would think of him not just as a lively participant in the field of Black queer studies, but taking a leading and shaping role in it. His work has engaged the ways in which power dynamics are multiply determined by class, race, and gender, and his impulse in approaching key theorists, from Marx and Althusser to Foucault and Rancière, has not been to discount their insights, but to add texture to their analyses by accounting for their blind spots and disavowals in any attempt to argue that power emerges from unitary sources or that there can be airbrushed solutions to political problems. Normative political theorizing about the family, class, and social progress, Ferguson argues, need to take account of the more contentiously embodied features of social life that cut across numerous axes of difference. It's never enough to talk about mere intersections among these categories, but to talk about their ever-changing patterns of dominance and collusion. He's worked out a series of groundbreaking arguments in 2 monographs, Aberrations in Black, toward a queer of color critique from 2004, and The Reorder of Things, the University and its Pedagogies of Minority Difference in 2012. And he has co-edited a volume with Grace Hong in 2011 entitled Strange Affinities, the Gender and Sexual Politics of Comparative Racialization, a volume that includes essays by Ferguson, Hong, and our very own Helen Jun, who is right in this room. In addition to these, well over 30 articles and reviews have ranged over the issues of gender, sexuality, race, class, and power, particularly in terms of the way that they inflect our social and institutional structures in the United States. In over 50 talks in the last 5 years alone, think about the frequent flyer miles, Rod has spoken on radical queer politics, the Black diaspora, and many issues pertaining to faculty, to pedagogy in the university, and so on. For those of you wanting to read some particularly trenchant recent work by Professor Ferguson, I would turn you to a couple of pieces he's written that should be required reading at the moment, one on intersectionality from 2012, and his recent article on Michael Brown in Cultural Critique from spring 2015. His honors and awards include most recently the Princeton University Old Dominion Fellowship for the Council of Learned Societies and the Center for African American Studies. He also received the Crompton Knoll Award from the Modern Language Association for an essay on Baldwin and the Other Side of Redemption. And that essay, for those of you who don't know what it honors, it is for the best essay in LGBT studies. Obviously, he was also the recipient of an Institute for the Humanities Faculty Fellowship, and I hope that you will warmly join me in welcoming him to talk about the Bookshop of Black Queer Diaspora.
All right, some people are really artful at introductions, and so thank you so much, Mark, for that really lovely introduction. Can people hear me in the back? Okay. And also I want to thank Linda Vavra for making all of this possible as well. Let me give you some context for this book project. It's an experimental book project, and so I need to kind of contextualize it a bit. All right, so it's a book project about Black queer art and activism in the 70s and 80s in the US, the UK, and Canada, and the challenges they were posing to neoliberalism broadly, as seen through state responses to HIV/AIDS, housing insecurity, the dismantling of social welfare, the exploitation of immigrant labor, and so on. Those histories are invoked through visits to a fictional Black queer bookshop and the evocations of the texts and artifacts that lie therein, all right? So today I'm going to present from the first chapter, which is actually about the 50s and early 60s. The idea is that to know the 70s and 80s, we have to return or relearn relationships between homoeroticism, anti-colonialism, and anti-racism. And in this chapter, an anonymous visitor goes to the bookshop to see some of Lorraine Hansberry's archival ephemera. You have come here to the bookshop because you have heard that they're featuring some of the recently released materials from Lorraine Hansberry's archive. Ever since you were a little girl, you've had a fascination with her. It all started when your parents moved to the suburbs. You remember how you felt being the only one in that elementary school, how everyone, teachers and students alike, thought in their polite condescension that because you were black, you were somehow remedial. And so, when the time came to choose a class project, replete with posters and photos, you decided that you would make yours about the smartest black girl that you ever heard of. To underline your unswerving 8-year-old interest in her, you could be seen carrying, at all times, a hardback copy of To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, making you the only third grader, boy or girl, who could boast of possessing her very own vade-mecum. You probably learned about her from some month's issue of Ebony magazine. You're not really sure, but in any case, it doesn't matter. You're here because there is still more to discover about her, even for you, the little black girl who needed to know everything about this writer because even before you were acquainted with the word and its hidden meanings, your dignity depended on it. You read about the materials in a newspaper article, the letters that Hansberry wrote to the lesbian periodical, The Ladder, at the end of the 1950s, and the lists of likes and dislikes that she would make out to herself. In fact, from November 2013 to March of 2014, the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum exhibited them. You couldn't make it all the way up there, but thank goodness for the bookshop. Somehow, in their customary magic, they managed to acquire some of the materials for a short time at least. There are 2 glass cases that sit in the middle of the room. In the middle of the main room, one case contains the pages of one of the letters. The other case contains her list of items on a sheet from a yellow pad. Inside the room, there are also posters of the Martinican intellectuals Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon. You've been to the bookshop many times, and like previous visits, the owners have juxtaposed objects whose proximity to one another begs for inquiry. Indeed, the letter, the list, and the posters come together to suggest a relationship between Hansberry's lesbianism and the insurgencies of anti-colonial struggle, something that the shop owners want their patrons to know. The first bit of correspondence that you see is a letter to the Ladder's editors. In it, Hansberry, using the initials LN for Lorraine Nemiroff, her married name, writes, quote, "I'm glad as heck that you exist. You are obviously serious people, and I feel that women, without wishing to foster any strict separatist notions, homo or hetero, indeed have a need for their own publications and organizations. Our problems, our experiences as women are profoundly unique as compared to the other half of the human race," end quote. You are drawn to the line, have a need for their own publications and organizations. You remember from one of the articles that the exhibit at the Brooklyn Art Museum situated Hansberry's homoeroticism within the homophobic repressions of the 1950s, and in many ways, that is appropriate and likely. But in the bookshop, you cannot help but ask the question whether other historical contexts might have also contributed to Hansberry's engagement with homosexual desire. By way of history, the 50s was the decade of insurgent struggles in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. In 1952, Fanon would publish Black Skin, White Mass. In 1954, Egypt's second president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, would, in the words of the post-colonial historian Robert J.C. Young, quote, "assume full political control of Egypt and negotiate the withdrawal of British troops," end quote. Also, the famous Bandung Conference would take place in April of 1955. In that year, Césaire would publish Discourse on Colonialism, and Fanon's A Dying Colonialism would be released in 1959. This was the moment of self-determination, the time in which the colonized would lay claim to the things nearest to them, their cultures, their histories, their lands. You remember reading about Hansberry's interest in anti-colonial liberation and how it seemed that the 50s was a period of her own anti-colonial education. In 1950, she would join the newspaper Freedom, which had been founded by Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois, partly as an experiment in uniting communist doctrine with black liberation. While on the staff of the newspaper, she would represent Robeson, whose passport had been voided because of his communist politics, at the 1952 Inter-American Peace Conference in Montevideo, Uruguay. She was among 250 delegates from communist peace organizations in Paraguay, Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina, Puerto Rico, Colombia, Chile, Uruguay, and the US. In attendance was the socialist and future president of Chile, Salvador Allende. While at Freedom, Hansberry would write articles about anti-colonial insurgency within Egypt and the Mau Mau rebellion against British colonialism in Kenya. You cannot help but read this interest in anti-colonial liberation along the desire for self-determination in her letter to the editors, as if her assertion that women needed their own publications and organizations derives somehow from not only the emergence of the homophile movement, but from the anti-colonial theme of the times. There's another letter in the case, one that she sent in 1957, 7 years after she began writing for Freedom. In this letter, she says, quote, "I think it is about time that equipped women began to take on some of the ethical questions which a male-dominated culture has produced and dissect and analyze them quite to pieces in a serious fashion. It is time that half the human race had something to say about the nature of its existence. Otherwise, without revised basic thinking, the woman intellectual is likely to find herself trying to draw conclusions, moral conclusions, based on acceptance of a social, moral superstructure which has never admitted to the equality of women and is therefore immoral itself. As per marriage, as per sexual practices, as per the rearing of children, etc. In this kind of work, there may be women to emerge who will be able to formulate a new and possible concept that homosexual persecution and condemnation has at its roots not only social ignorance, but a philosophically active anti-feminist dogma. But that is but a kernel of a speculative embryonic idea improperly introduced here," end quote. The conventional way of talking about gay liberation in the 1950s is by invoking such groups as the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis, the group that published the latter. But those invocations only tell part of Hansberry's story and the story of queer sexuality, it seems. Those stories occlude the other segments of Hansberry's life, the work that she did for freedom, and the speeches in which she located her politics and art within the movements of third world liberation. As she said in an interview with Studs Terkel, quote, "I'm very much concerned and caught up in the movements of African peoples toward liberation out of colonialism," end quote. If we forget that interest, we fail to ask the question of how, for Hansberry and for others, the incitement to sexuality might very well have been provoked by the inquiries and grammars of third world and anti-colonial liberation. By not probing this connection, we can tell ourselves that both race and queer sexuality during the 1950s were internal dramas, never referring to and never generating anything but themselves, intramural formations unfolding simply within the confines of the nation, rather than struggles that were inspired from both within and outside national boundaries. You spent some time looking at that line about Hansberry's refusal to accept the social, moral superstructure of heterosexual patriarchy and the need to think and live beyond it. Your mind runs to another set of lines. These come from Césaire's The Discourse on Colonialism, in which he too argues for the refusal to endure the reigning discourse about race. He writes, quote, "For us, the problem is not to make a utopian and sterile attempt to repeat the past, but to go beyond. It is not a dead society that we want to revive. We leave that to those who go in for exoticism. Nor is it the present colonial society that we wish to prolong, the most putrid carrion that ever rotted under the sun. It is a new society that we must create with the help of all our brother slaves, a society rich with all the productive power of modern times, warm with all the fraternity of the olden days." Both Hansberry and Césaire are concerned with how not to repeat the past and prolong the present as the uninterrupted homage to yesterday. Instead, they suggest that the awakening insurgencies of the moment can be the occasions of productive interruptions and new creations. You begin to realize that the shopkeepers have placed things the way they are because they want to suggest a genealogical interest in the beyond of present-day knowledge formations and institutions. That Hansberry's letters and the theme of anti-colonialism are not merely similar, that in fact they may belong to the same constellation of discourses. In The Archaeology of Knowledge, Michel Foucault argued that discourses that seemed unrelated to one another could in fact be part of the same formation. As he said, quote, "Such discourses as economics, medicine, grammar, the science of living, beings, give rise to certain organizations of concepts, certain regroupings of objects, certain types of enunciation which form, according to their degree of coherence, rigor, and stability, themes or theories. Whatever their formal level may be, I shall call these themes and theories strategies," end quote. The themes that appear with a certain degree of regularity and coherence in Hansberry's lesbian correspondence and the anti-colonial writings of the time have to do with autonomy, insurgency, and liberation, especially for those formations that have historically known suppression, regulation, and exclusion. The arrangement of the materials from Hansberry's archive in relation to the pictures of Césaire and Fanon suggests that a certain understanding of liberation and institutional alternatives were shaping discourses of homoeroticism and anti-colonialism simultaneously, an understanding in which womanhood, queerness, and blackness were increasingly enunciated as incitements to move beyond the taken for granted state of affairs. The idea that a discourse on gender and sexual liberation might share a discursive association with anti-colonialism flies in the face of presumptions like the one that Fanon made in 1952. In Black Skin, White Mass, for instance, he said this about homosexuality, quote, "Let me observe at once that I had no opportunity to establish the overt presence of homosexuality in Martinique. This must be viewed as the result of the absence of the Oedipus complex in the Antilles. The schema of homosexuality is well enough known. We should not overlook, however, the existence of what are called there men dressed like women or godmothers. Generally, they wear shirts and skirts, but I am convinced that they lead normal sex lives. They can take a punch like any he-man, and they are not impervious to the allures of women, fish, and vegetable merchants. In Europe, on the other hand, I have known several Martinicans who became homosexuals, always passive, but this was by no means a neurotic homosexuality. For them, it was a means to a livelihood, as pimping is to others," end quote. In the book, Fanon assigned homosexuality to white men, deeming it a falsehood when it came to black men. for white men's psychic fear of their black counterparts stood as the evidence of the white male's sublimated attraction to black men. As he put it, quote, "The negrophobic, i.e. white man, is a repressed homosexual," end quote. Homosexuality, as far as Fanon was concerned, was the province of men, and of white men at that. In a moment in which homosexuality and lesbianism in particular strained the public and the anti-colonial imagination, Hansberry's letters point to the possibility of a constitutive and genealogical affinity between homoerotic and anti-colonial insurgencies. As the Bookshop curates Hansberry's letters within the moments of anti-colonial and anti-racist movements, it shows how the desire for homoerotic autonomy might have transitioned from those movements, not just for Hansberry, but perhaps in general. We can read the letters as a way of discerning the trace of anti-colonial and anti-racist agitation on homoerotic desire. In doing so, we have a chance, finally, of interpreting homoerotic desire as a discourse arising out of internationalist struggles over self-determination, insurgency, and collective belonging, and not simply out of domestic efforts of gay and lesbian civil rights. In this reading, nationalist movements, despite their heteropatriarchal and homophobic practices, might be interpreted as providing the grammar and stimulation for queer desires. Read as such, anti-racist and anti-colonial movements, to use Foucault's language, might not have been simply repressive in their engagements with gender and sexuality, but multiplicative and inscriptive as well. You're now looking at the list that Hansberry made to herself and trying to make sense of the items on them. There's a paper dated April 1st, 1960. One column lists her likes and another itemizes her hates. Under I like, you see, Mahalia Jackson's music, my husband most of the time, getting dressed up, being admired for my looks, Dorothy Sekulas's eyes, Dorothy Sekulas, Shakespeare, having an appetite, slacks, my homosexuality, being alone, Eartha Kitt's looks, Eartha Kitt, older women, charming women, and or intelligent women. Under I hate, she's written, being asked to speak, speaking, too much male, my loneliness, my homosexuality, stupidity, most television programs, what has happened to Sidney Poitier, racism, people who defend it, seeing my picture, reading my interviews, Jean Genet's plays, Jean-Paul Sartre's writings, not being able to work, death, pain, cramps, being hung over, silly women as silly men, David Suskind's pretensions, sneaky love affairs. You try to make sense of the cascade of entries, and the only thing that you can come away with is that the list is the evidence of someone in the midst of evolving. Your mind runs to an exhibit that a friend told you about. In 2009, the Italian writer and scholar Umberto Eco was invited to curate a series of exhibits for the Louvre. That assignment culminated in an exhibition about the role of lists in art, which he entitled Vertige de la Liste. About lists, he said, quote, "The list is the origin of culture. It's part of the history of art and literature. What does culture want? To make infinity comprehensible," end quote. Eco then went further to offer a sense of the epistemological function of lists. Quote, "Look, ever since the days of Aristotle, we have been trying to define things based on their essence. Now, it took naturalists 80 years to come up with the definition of a platypus. They found it endlessly difficult to describe the essence of this animal. It lives underwater and on land. It lays eggs, and yet it's a mammal. So what did the definition look like? It was a list of characteristics," end quote. And from this, he would hazard a description, quote, "The list is the mark of a highly advanced, cultivated society, because a list allows us to question the essential definitions. The essential definition is primitive compared with the list," end quote. In echo sense, Hansberry's list can be understood as a rebellion against the essential definitions surrounding her, definitions of what it means to be a woman, a black, and a lesbian. As such, her list attempts to move beyond the logocentrism of existing representations as they pertain to race, gender, and sexuality. Given that the 50s and 60s were the moments of anti-colonial and anti-racist campaigns to move beyond the essences assigned to minoritized subjects, how appropriate that Hansberry would try to evolve a sense of her own womanhood and queerness by making lists. In his book, like Andy Warhol, the theorist Jonathan Flatley discusses Warhol's penchant for collecting and liking, well, just about everything. Bottles, jewelry, Native American blankets, Art Deco furniture, watches, art by Man Ray, Paul Klee, and Duchamp, busts of Benjamin Franklin, Russell White dishes. The list goes on and on. Relating Warhol's habit of liking to queerness, Flatley argues, quote, "Warhol's practice of liking is an attempt to imagine new queer forms of emotional attachment and affiliation, and to transform the world into a place where these forms can find a home," end quote. Similarly, Hansberry's lists point to an attempt to imagine queer forms of identification, whether those identifications be to a husband that she likes most of the time, her attraction to older, charming, intelligent women, or to being alone. Moreover, the list is also a desire that these likes might have a place to root themselves, a publication, an organization, a place where people would be glad as heck that it existed, transforming the world into a place where these forms could exist is the expression of an alternative will to institutionality. In Hansberry's lists are the micro details of desire, and there, in the bookshop, you consider what it would mean to read the list as an expression of internationalist and anti-colonial discourses, discourses applied this time not to the circumstances and futures of the nation state, but extended to the parameters of the body. In the list, then, we can hear the trace of a language of self-determination, not as it relates to land and its sovereignty, but to the body and its coexistence with other bodies and modes of desire. We have been told in the dominant historiography that insurgency moored itself in one locale, that of the nation state or the aspirations thereof. And so, insurgency has typically been asked in terms of the nation's possibilities for liberation. But far from insurgency docking in one area, that of the nation state, insurgency would anchor itself in a variety of social domains, activating subjects in all of these planes, revealing insurgency to be not a unidirectional discourse, but a multidirectional one, distributed throughout a variety of sites from the territory of the nation to the terrain of the body, to the constitution and reorganization of knowledge, to the province of sexual desire and pleasure. Anti-colonial and anti-racist liberations would help to generate agendas of freedom and dynamic individuation for a whole host of subjects and domains. The convention is to narrate the desire for social change as one that took place among social movements, but there is every reason to believe that movement desires created series of subjective desires organized to produce different forms of racial, gender, and erotic autonomies. Whether it applied its visions to the political economy of the nation, or to the expansion of what could be known, or to the forms of gender and erotic sovereignties, insurgency would incite us to work on and beyond our limited historical inheritance. Hansberry's list can be said to spring from the same discursive constellation as that of anti-colonial protests, a discursive constellation concerning insurgency and its various destinations. This genre of insurgency can be seen in another list of hers, one in which she says, "I like 69 when it works. The inside of a lovely woman's mouth, the way little JW looks in the movies, her coquettishness, her behind, those fresh little muscles. The searching and voluptuous qualities of the list intimate a subject who assumes the right to erotic inquiry, a right that would become a defining feature of the social worlds to come. Like the theme of insurgency in this list, the right to inquiry has a multi-platform character, taking residence not only in erotic, but conventionally intellectual domains as well. For instance, in a speech delivered on March 1st, 1959, just 2 weeks before the Broadway debut of A Raisin in the Sun, Hansberry delivered a credo at a major conference on Black writers that was sponsored by the American Society of African Culture, a speech entitled "The Negro Writer and His Roots Toward a New Romanticism." She wrote, "There is a desperate need in our time for the Negro writer to assume a partisanship in what I believe has been the traditional battleground of writers of stature for centuries, namely the war against the illusions of one's time and culture. And there are several illusions rampant in contemporary American culture, which in my opinion deserve the critical attention of Black artists in particular. In defining those illusions and addressing how they might push an intellectual formation into new horizons, here again, she made a list. Most people who work for a living, and they are few, are executives and or work in some kind of office. Women are idiots. People are white. Negroes do not exist. When a girl takes off her glasses and unpins her hair, she becomes a woman. Sex is the basis of all psychological, economic, political, historical, social, in fact, known problems of man. Sexual ideas of the past will be the sexual ideas of the future. Things as they are as they are, and have been and will be that way because they got that way because things were as they were in the first place. The present social order is here forever, and this is the best of all possible worlds. The present social order is here forever, and this is the worst of all possible worlds. But there is nothing we can do about it anyway, human nature being what it is. The present social order does not exist. It is all in the mind. In this instance, the list becomes part of an effort to organize the critical itineraries and knowledge production of Black artists and intellectuals. The list is an expression of her view that, quote, the compelling obligation of the Negro writer as writer and citizen of life is participation in the intellectual affairs of all men everywhere, end quote. This view of Black intellection as the rush toward infinity is part of the legacy of the list as an epistemological form. In her discussion of Echo's exhibition and the role that lists have played in artistic and intellectual endeavors, the art historian Kathleen Morris writes, quote, intuiting that lists are not only reflective of knowledge as it exists at a given moment, but that they actively produce knowledge, savvy artists and writers have taken up the list form in order to suggest and sometimes create alternative knowledge, shifting the epistemology of the list in directions its form makes possible, end quote. Hansberry's list of illusions can be interpreted as her attempt to suggest and create alternative routes for and orderings of Black knowledge production. Each time you come to the bookshop, you try to figure out not only what new texts have come in for purchase, but also what messages the bookshop conveys in the arrangement and variation of things. You look again at the display case, and then at the posters, and realize that from the way that the space has been curated, the shopkeepers are proposing a different mode of studying the history of insurgency and sexuality. That to study insurgent movements would mean a new historiography altogether. Insurgency would not simply denote the whens, the hows, and the wheres of social movements. Insurgency would signify the revolutions that take place at the level of the body and subjectivity, that rather than following one route, that of the nation's independence and liberation, the discourse of insurgency would disperse itself among a variety of discontinuous planes, from that of decolonized nation states, to the racial identities of Black diasporic subjects, to the site of the body and the encroachments that the racial state might have on it, and to the body again and the possibilities of its racial, gender, and sexual emancipation. Situating sexuality accordingly would mean that the body might have a destiny other than that of being used for the aims of power, that sexuality might name our efforts to possibly disrupt, as Angela Davis has put it, the endless repetition of history. You notice that the shopkeepers have placed prints and figurines of clowns around the room. One of the other patrons tells you that they did so because of Hansberry's fondness for them. In his foreword to Be Young, Gifted, and Black, Hansberry's widower, Robert Nemiroff, said this, quote, "She surrounded herself with clowns, clown knickknacks, figurines, doodads, and comic get-well-quick cards. She considered herself one of these, the little people, the oddballs, the hapless, funny ones," end quote. It's not lost to you that the clowns are another way of emphasizing the Bookshop's argument about the relationship between insurgency and the given state of affairs, that the clowns, as queer and disruptive figures, point to the need for moving beyond the sanctity of the existing conditions and moving toward the joyful and playful acquisition of new capabilities. Thank you. All right, questions, comments? Yeah, Liz.
That was great. Thanks, Rod. I actually have like a stylistic question.
Yeah, sure.
I was wondering about the choice of the speaker as you, because, I guess I'm just wondering about it because in some ways it's almost as if, and I don't know if you do that in the other chapters of the book, but then each of those figures becomes a kind of object in and of themselves, and I was wondering how you're thinking about creating like your own archive of objects who are persons, because it's not coming from like sort of first-person narration of their consciousness. It's more like you thought you did. I was wondering about that choice and how that functions in the project as a whole.
Yeah, that was an excellent question. So two things. The you was really inspired by Claudia Rankine's Citizen, where she uses that pronoun in all of the poems. And just as you say, in that book, the various yous operate as different subjects, and also subjectivities, who have encountered, various forms of racism. So that was the inspiration for that. I do use you in all of the chapters, but with a different you. So again, as you anticipate, right, it is a kind of deliberation on, not just the art objects and textual objects in the bookshop, but also the various, sort of, dramatis personae of subjectivities that also, and that's also, part of my interest in just Black bookshops. And, what happened to people when they entered the bookshop and when they kept going to the bookshops. The inspiration for the motif of the bookshop came from two exhibits that I saw around 2 or 3 years ago in London. One exhibit was by the Autoliv group, based in London, an art group collective there, in which they took the elements of the artist platform based in South Africa called the Chimurenga Library. And, so for instance, they had the headlines. They made an entire wall of the headlines from the newspaper from the Chimurenga Library. And then they had the footnotes from some of the text that Chimurenga Library puts, on the floor. So you're actually walking through the text itself, right? And then a few days after that, there was an exhibit at the Guildhall Art Gallery on a now defunct Black bookshop, Bogle le Vulture bookshop, which is probably like one of the most popular Black bookshops in London. At the time, it used to be housed in West London. And so at the Guildhall, you walk in and there are display cases of the letters that the two owners, these two Guyanese immigrants, Eric and Jessica Huntley, wrote to each other. Eric immigrated first. No, yeah, that's right. Eric immigrated first, and then Jessica and the children. But there was all this art that was inspired by the Huntleys and the bookshop in that first room, and in the next room, there were these facsimiles of Jessica Huntley's desk, her typewriter, the bookshelves. And when I walked into that space, it just brought back all these memories of my first Black bookshop, which is where I got my first Black books from, in Georgia. It's still there. It's called the Shrine of the Black Madonna bookstore. And the very first books I got from by Gwendolyn Brooks, the Negritude poets, Arnold Rampersad's biographies of Langston Hughes. Those were all these things that I got from an aunt who lived in Atlanta and sent them to me or gave them to me as a Christmas gift. And then when there was a friend who was giving us a tour, who was also one of the organizers of the exhibition at the Guildhall Gallery. And he said, it's interesting because there was another African-American woman who came in and said, I know this place. She's like, I've never been to this particular bookshop, but I remember what these bookshops were and the entire worlds that were in those bookshops. So, there's a way in which, part of what I'm trying to do is to recreate a world. It has to be a fictional one because I don't know of any Black queer bookshops, So in many ways, it is the world that could have been, that should have been, or the institution that could have been, the institution that should have been, but the one that also, sort of mimics the practices of the Black bookshops from back in the day. And the other you is that around the character, that's actually my cousin's story. She was a little, when she was a Black little girl, she had this to me, unexplained fascination with Lorraine Hansberry, and yeah, she talked about as an 8-year-old girl, like to be young, gifted, and Black, and she had her whole school project around the thing, and I just thought, well, maybe she likes it, and I'm 5 years older than she is, so in many ways she's like my little sister I don't have to take seriously, right? And I just thought, oh, maybe she likes it because she was a little Black girl with a fur coat. So then, Hansberry was. And then so later on, when we were adults, I said to her, what was your fascination with Hansberry? And she said, because I was at that school and all those people thought that I was dumb because I was a Black girl. And so she said, and I decided I'm gonna pick this woman, who is, a consummate intellectual, as a rebuttal to those folks. And so that's where that you comes from, There are other yous that are based on stories that I've heard. For instance, in another chapter, the you there is this young Black kid who finds a used copy of the Black A anthology, Brother to Brother, and he reads it secretly, in the library. And that's based on a true story as well. Yeah, Mark.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about about the bookshop strategy and its relationship to you as the theorist slash critic, because one of the things that I was noticing in this wonderful talk was that the issue of arrangement and an argument is being attributed to the bookshop itself, and to the curation that goes on in the bookshop. And I just think that that's such a fascinating strategy, and I was wondering if you could just talk about that, and also maybe the question of why now, in where we are, in our intellectual history. And
yeah, sure. So thank you. So in terms of the strategy for the bookshop, there's several things that come to mind as an answer. On one level, I was dealing with these histories and, in many instances, these artifacts, and in other cases, artworks, before I came to the bookshop, as a motif. And then I couldn't figure out, so how do I make sense of having Hume or Umberto Eco in the same paper with, Hansberry or Audre Lorde or Rotimi Fanny Coyote, the photographer, or Ajamu, the photographer, or what have you. And then I thought, okay, because it's going to look like it's random. But then when I went to these exhibits, I thought, oh, this is actually the perfect institution, because there's a way in which the bookshop, like libraries, make use of randomness and the chaos, of textual display, right? And so, if you think of, I was just rereading Borges's The Library of Babel, about this library that is, based on infinity.
So that's your Foucault connection.
Yeah, totally right. Exactly right. So like in the order of things, right? And so it seemed to me to be, a kind of perfect, topos for, making sense of, the arbitrariness of associations, in many ways, libraries, bookstores, bookshelves, are all about, producing an order out of the arbitrariness of the things that are selected, and which is also part of the, epistemological inquiry of the book. How is it that certain types of associations, came together as part of intellectual formation, so that when, the argument here that Hansberry, is also part of what the bookshop does, but also part of what, I would assert Hansberry is, wrestling with, is a connection between, homoeroticism and anti-colonialism, right? Well, in many ways, I need to answer that question kind of to explain myself and to explain other Black queer folks, right? Like nationalism was my first critical formation, Revolutionary nationalism was that. It was like, the Panthers in high school, we were going to remake ourselves into like, some version of SNCC, after they had like, disbanded from the civil rights movement. We were going to be Pan-Africanist and all of that. And then you learn that that's actually a lot of people's formations. Like, it is Jackie Alexander's formation. It's Barbara Smith's formation, where, national liberation as that thing that has to be critiqued for its patriarchal and homophobic exclusions is also part of your DNA. So what kind of language do you need to create to make sense of that inscription, And so that's really what I'm going after in this first chapter, right? That, you're not going to wave away a history. You're not going to wave, even the history that, that is painful for you, in terms of the homophobia, in terms of the sexism, because there are also elements of it that account for who you are, So how do you talk then about the way in which it has inscribed you, but you refuse to allow it to reproduce itself in you, And that seems to me to be a really interesting just epistemological question, too, So, I mean, that's why the part where I say it is multiplicative in terms of Foucault, but it is also inscriptive, And how do you not become a prisoner to the inscription, Yeah. Jenny and then Judith.
Sorry I was late, so forgive me.
Yeah.
I was teaching. I have two questions. One is a comment. So I was just thinking about the thing that came into my mind when you said that there wasn't a black queer bookshop was Kitchen Table Press.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that world of knowledge production, black feminist, black lesbian knowledge production looks like, and how that could function in a related way. That's just one thing that I was thinking about. And then the other thing is how much I love when I teach women's history, I often teach about lists, and I ask students to make lists, and I ask them to think about what lists do.
Yeah.
What I love about this, and seeing this list in Hansberry's own pen, is how much, and this is one of the things that I find so exciting about your work, is that you take these genres and you change the way we understand them. So in Aberrations in Black, there's something about, you're not used to sort of seeing Audre Lorde in the context of the history of sociology in some ways. And here, what it means to think about a list, because in some ways, the world you're describing is a world of material culture, is a world of public history, of what it means to sort of interpret texts that are different.
It's the whole sensorium.
Yeah, and so I'm fascinated by that and what it means for you to look for these genres to read through these other lenses, and how that works for you. I mean, maybe that is the bookstore, maybe that is what you're saying, but I just see it in this very particular way, like what it was like to read the chapter on Audre Lorde and think about, or Toni Morrison, to think about what it means in that context. And then to go to this, which is another, form of outside of your discipline, and what it means to sort of come at it from this other place that recognizes its importance and doesn't try to undercut it, but reads it in a very different way.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So, two things kind of come to mind. I remember when one of my readers' reports for Aberrations said that this manuscript is filled with questionable juxtapositions. And then I thought, your objection is my intention.
Juxtaposition is my method.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so, precisely that, part of what, I'm trying to do with the metaphor of the bookshop, but also the sort of characters and the way in which they kind of stumble upon things, is to, sort of recover and retain, the sort of informal aspects of a methodology that, you stumble upon things, all the time. If somebody tells you something, you hear a bit of it, and it sends you off somewhere, right? Like, that's very different than, for instance, there's a piece by the black political scientist Martin Kilson that I've just been mad about. It was written in 1971, and it's called something like Reflections on the Structure of Black Studies. And one of the things that he wants to do is to take down those activists, and lay scholars who brought about black studies because they were not trained, They were not certified, they did not have formal methodological training, and, in many ways he's saying the institution has to make room for the trained people and get these activists and these militants, out of the way, which is also a kind of methodological controversy for him, right? That they don't have adequate training, And the irony of that for me is that the beginnings of black studies were in scrapbooks, in the 19th century and the early 20th century, where, people who were just lay historians were just, making scrapbooks out of things that they found in newspapers or magazines or advertisements. And those scrapbooks became the beginnings of what we now know as like the Schomburg, Center for Black Culture, or Fisk University's archive, or Howard University's Moreland Spingarn. All of those things started with the informal method of just bumping into things and finding, things, right? And so part of me wants to also retain that and also elevate it to the level of what it is. It is a kind of epistemological controversy, right?
Ida B. Wells, I just taught her today. She makes lists of everything.
Yeah, exactly, right.
List after list after list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Pretty incredible to look at her list.
Yeah. And so part of what attracts me so much to Hansberry and these lists is that, you really do feel and see her using the list to put pressure on, the existing boundaries, to go over them, which for me has all kinds of interesting intellectual connections to, like Foucault or Heidegger or, whatever, There was another part to your question.
Just kitchen table press.
Kitchen table press, yes. So that part where I have in here about the list and the letters, especially that part where she talks about we need our own organizations and things, then I'm really interested in the will to an alternative institutionality, Because in many ways, my book, The Reorder of Things, is about trying to assess the will to a dominant institutionality. How is it that the interdisciplinary fields, gender studies, ethnic studies, queer studies, are trying to fit in, within the administrative order, right? But then one also has to think seriously about those moments where people were really trying to produce an alternative will to institutionality, right? And so Kitchen Table Press is one of those, for me. So how do we, think about something like that wasn't trying to conform to a regular press house? In fact, it was because the regular press houses were excluding women of color writers that they started that one just around the kitchen table, And so what are the components of, what are the components, shaky as they are, fragile as they are, for a kind of alternative institutional practice and construction? And so in many ways, that's also what the, why the bookshop, why the bookshop metaphor, because, there's a part where this character says, you come to the bookshop not just because of the new texts that are there for your purchase, but because there's an intellectual question that the bookshop and the shopkeepers are putting to you. So already there are signals that the bookshop is not, it's not trying to fit within the capitalist mode, of an enterprise either. So what is that eccentricity, and how do we use it for, now, how do we use it for building our own kind of alternative institutional practices within a place like this, Yeah, Heidi.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, I was just thinking, along the lines of what you're saying now, kind of for me, there's a little bit of a nostalgia in your presentation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just really moving, and, to what extent, I guess, can this kind of model of thinking, which I think you really lay out so nicely, the proximity, juxtaposition, kind of the physicality that we're bumping into things that, it seems like the body is really crucial here, and I like the link to a kind of space that's not about the nation. Then to what extent can we replicate that, in this new media age, right? Which is precisely supposed to be transnational or global, but yet, the bookstores or where the bookshops are sort of, it's like all that potential. But we cannot
Right.
what you're describing.
Right.
Right? So I don't know what
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, you can't, you're not going to have the same kind of sensorium on Amazon, that, exactly right, that you would in, a black bookstore, a women's bookstore. Like, I remember when I was telling a colleague initially about the bookshop metaphor, and then, and she was like, oh, she put her hands up to her face. She's like, I can still smell the incense. Like you can't do that, online. You can have other memories, but you can't have that kind of stuff. You can't have the sort of random bumping into, the other patron who just wants to talk to you about, like Rastafarianism, and you can't have those kind of, like Samuel Delaney talks about it in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, the sort of the contact zones and things. You can't have that kind of context. So in many ways, it is a sort of nostalgia, but also a kind of appreciation for what was, but also what could still be. Like, I would love it if somebody would start a bookshop, a Blackbird bookshop at some point after reading, or something like that,
exactly. That's the question of like, what can it be? Because there are a couple of bookshops that, right? Just like Women of the First. That
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
But there's not much.
Yeah.
So what is that future exactly?
Yeah, totally right. And also, I mean, it's really a question of how do we get people to take seriously the task of trying to produce an alternative will to institutionality? Like, how do you get people to say that that's a worthwhile, project? So, thanks. Hey, Madhu. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Judith and then Madhu. Judith.
From where I am, most of what I can see is I'm bored to death with the raising of the sun. So I've been thinking about that as I sit here. And how are you seeing then this stage of Hansberg in relation to her own trajectory, the statement of disavowal?
Yeah, totally, yeah. Yeah, I think like, in terms of like I'm bored to death with the raisin in the sun, in many ways it also goes back to, the argument that the list is also the representation of a subject and process, and that, because I'm sure, other folks in the room have felt this, but I certainly have felt it where, you finish a text and for you, the moment it goes out into the world, it's banal. And then other people are interested in it, and then, for them it's new, and they want you to keep talking about it, and it's like, but that's really, like what does Nietzsche says that the writer is the precondition of the text, the reader is the condition of the text. It's like, this is your text now, I don't want anything to do with it. I moved on to something else, I'm becoming something different. And so whenever I look at that part, I think about my own sort of process around, trying to become reacquainted, but also reinvested in, it's like a marriage or something, or a relationship. I got to reinvest in this person who I've been with. And,
At the same time, she's pushing herself away. Just the title of Raising in the Sun is situating herself in a black literary tradition.
Yeah.
She clearly wants to keep up. And it's that kind of, I don't know if it's a balance, but oscillation.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that, there's another part. I've also used, just as some context for this this response, I used Toni Morrison's Nobel address to figure out how to, create a kind of expository text that also has a kind of fictional element in it. So she, in that Nobel address, uses the fictional character of the black old or wise woman, blind, who has a thesis about language. And so, where was I going with that? So she says, for instance, she says, among her people, this is what Morrison says, among her people, she is known as both the law and its transgression. So I read that in terms of Hansberry, that she is both situated in the literature, but she's also trying to get the literature to do something else. She's always trying to get it to renew itself and to become something, different. Hence, the sign in Sidney Brustein's window, which is very different from A Raisin in the Sun, but also the piece that she wrote, which was a kind of opposite of Jean Genet's The Blacks, Les Blancs. Someone who is always launching herself into self-experimentation. Okay, Madhu.
This is more connected with the previous question. I'm not sure if I heard this part right, but did you, in the beginning, did you say that the period that you're dealing with is the 70s and the 80s specifically?
Yeah.
So throughout all the chapters?
Well, in this chapter, it's the 50s and the 60s, but, saying that the 50s and the 60s and this sort of relationship between anti-colonialism's, anti-racism's inscription on, Black diasporic queer formations is a necessary prehistory for the main history of 70s and 80s.
So if that's what you're doing, then it kind of, the bookshop trope makes perfect sense, right? Like almost in a historical way.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you're saying something about how print culture worked as an alternative
Yeah.
institutional space.
Totally, yeah. Exactly.
Decades. But I think it would be really interesting then to talk about the ways in which that sphere has withered. Because it has, like, no matter how utopian we want to be, like these bookshops have just disappeared.
Yeah, no, totally.
In most places.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if you're trying to make more of a historical point about, what the print public sphere meant at a certain moment in diasporic.
Yeah, I'm absolutely trying to make that argument, and also the argument of loss, or not just the argument of loss, but the demonstration of loss. That, in one of the other chapters, I've tried to sort of, produce a kind of sense of mourning, too, that like everything's fragile. In fact, in one of the other chapters, one of the patrons says, if we lose this, we'll have nothing, And there's always the anticipation that it's going to be lost because everything is, being lost and stuff in terms of the fragility of Black institutions and institutions for people of color,
And so you don't see glimpses of a non-print alternative diasporic, culture of a public sphere taking shape. It's not just lost, but maybe.
Yeah, I do. I should out myself as I'm a Luddite when it comes to that kind of stuff. Like I still buy books, but I don't want to foreclose another person's possibility in terms of this. But I do want them to know. Okay, so for instance, if you are a reader of this eventual book, and you're the online person, and you're very dedicated to that, what parts can you take from what has been lost to shape the online experience, I think that's actually a really interesting project, and so I would like to write the book in such a way to say, okay, yeah, now it's in your hands. If you're going to do this online thing, it's in your hands, and, there is no sort of legislated way of doing this, so,
Unless you narrate an audio book.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. And people have done that. This is the other thing. There's this woman, Katrina Palmer, who's this British artist who narrates, via audio, like her walks. And, you're like, yeah, it's like your public history, thing. People do it. And so, yeah, that could be done. I would actually like to see it have many different iterations, right? Sort of online and, there's something necessary about meeting people you never would have met, or having conversations you never would have had. And you know, it's like when I went to Colleen Smith's exhibit, her exhibit at the Art Institute, you know, it's called Human 3.0 for those who don't know it, and it's, you know, she's drawn the covers of books that she's comprised as her radical reading list. And then I was standing in front of her drawing of the Autobiography of Malcolm X. And there was a white couple, older white couple, man and woman, one British, one South African, I think I got that right. And the woman said to me, she said, if he had lived, things would have been different, you know, than what they are now. And then we had this great, she was a former, they were both former members of the Communist Party, and they were very much into, you know, anti-racist struggle. So we had the best conversation, you know, in that chance encounter. You can have that, you know. I'm thinking about a student whose committee I'm on, and her work on the blogosphere among disabled, you know, subjects and stuff. You can have that, but you know, like, you know, I can't have the smell of her, and I can't have, you know, the image of her sweater, and you know, and her, you know, at the end, like patting me on the arm, and that, you know, that actually matters, like, you know, in terms of a sensorial experience.
Yeah, I'm also thinking of the, you know, the archive that you kind of connected me to, the Chimurenga.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
You know, which is only possible online, right? So I don't know.
You can get those,
positive about.
but you can order and get those.
You can get the physical copies too.
Yeah, yeah.
They haven't switched over to a purely online.
No.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of they're both, because they also have, you know, the Pan-Africa Space Station, the radio station that you can listen to, you know, so they do both. They have the hard copies of the sort of pavement literature, the little books that they do, and the broadsheet, the chronic, you know, which, you know, you can receive in the mail and open up like in the old-fashioned way, and you see alternative maps of Africa, you know, and things like that. So. Hi, Peter, yeah.
So you, if I understand this, you've been arguing for, pointing out affinities among various forms of discourses of liberation.
Yeah.
Gay liberation, national liberation, anti-racism, anti-sexism. Now, maybe this is unfair, but if you go from the discourse to the thing the discourse is about, it seems to me you get a very different picture.
Okay, say more about that. That's
well,
interesting.
The actual movements, I mean, the national liberation movements were not particularly known for being opposed to, for being in favor of gay liberation.
Oh, no, yeah. Many of them were horrible.
And certainly, if you look at the nations that came out of those movements, some of them great, others among the worst places on the planet for the gay liberation, anti-sexism,
absolutely,
even
yeah.
anti-racism.
Yeah, yeah.
So there seems to me, if you look at the discourses, you note affinities and connections.
Oh, yeah.
If you look at the facts on the ground, it looks very different.
Oh, yeah, completely.
So the question is, what are you going to do with that?
You know, I mean, right.
Are we going to say that people writing those discourses were naive? Are we going to say, well, maybe the affinities are not so clear as we thought? Or
yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would make the claim about the people were naive who were writing the discourses. You know, what interests me is, I mean, precisely what you've gotten at, the connections that are also the tensions, you know, within those and between those discourses. You know, so for instance, one of the lines from a colleague who wrote the classic piece, and also a dear friend, Jack Alexander, wrote this piece called Not Just Anybody Can Be a Citizen. And she's talking about the transition from colonialism to independence in Trinidad, Tobago, and Barbados. And, you know, she's from Tobago. And so, you know, she's also someone who lived through, you know, the transition from colonialism to liberation. And then she says in this line, in this first paragraph, we all thought that Massa's day done, you know, that it would be an end to the regulations that they knew as colonized subjects. And then she says immediately after that, what do those states do? They criminalize homosexuality, you know? And so she says, I now find myself a criminal in the country of my birth, you know, even as someone who fought for liberation from the colonizers and stuff. And so it's precisely that, you know, that I want to get at. You know, again, this is the sort of, what do you do with the inscription? You know, for instance, I am someone who, you know, for all of my writing up until this point, I have leaned on that part, you know, that you've gotten at, the tension, right? But, you know, I have also not spent enough time, I've decided, you know, saying how there was the connection, like we were in it too, you know? I mean, like I said, I was that nationalist black kid, you know, in high school, and then I discovered feminism. And then the critique of nationalism became something absolutely necessary, you know, for me. And that's the story of so many folks, right? That, you know, how is it that the thing that you spend your time, your efforts, your political, your ethical commitments, opposing, challenging, it is also of you. It is of your formation. You know, there's a way in which I would never have gotten a critique of racial capitalism without revolutionary nationalism, you know? There's a way in which I would have never gotten, you know, the kind of diasporic, not even just diasporic, but the kind of global interest in anti-colonial movements had I not read the writings of the Black Panthers, and they're talking about Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong, you know? And, you know, it's interesting, Lorraine Hansberry has this moment, too, in the Stud Circle interview where she is talking about the character Assegai from A Raisin in the Sun, the African suitor intellectual. And then she says, you know, he is completely unromantic about nationalism because he knows that one day the very people who have taken control away from the colonizers might come and do the same thing. And he says, well, and Benitha, you know, the intellectual daughter in the family, says, well, what do you do when, you know, the black people become as crooked, you know, as their colonial oppressors? And he says, well, you know, history will take care of them too. But, you know, before you critique independence, get it, is what she said. You know, and so it is precisely that, you know, tension that is something I'm trying to figure out and make legible. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this, and especially for letting us look at this list and hear you talk about it. I come fresh from the premiere of the Lorraine Hansberry documentary they showed in Chicago at the International Film Festival.
Oh, see, which I haven't seen.
That's okay,
Yeah.
because you're so ahead of the curve, as usual. But they show the lists
Oh,
in
cool.
the film.
Oh, good.
And then the thing that made me, I'm just thinking about the two things, the different ways that these are presented.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's a documentary with PBS funding. It looks like American Master is going to be probably, I'm guessing February.
Okay,
You'll see
yeah,
it on
yeah,
PBS.
totally. Yeah.
Guess?
Yeah.
But one of the things that I did, and there's not much said about this, you know, and I would so much love to hear more. I want this chapter to be so much longer because I want to hear more about what you think about the things on the list.
Mm-hmm.
Like, when it flashed on the screen in the film, I was like, who's going to talk about how my homosexuality is on every part of the list? Please,
Right, yeah,
Rob,
right, yeah.
talk about that.
Yeah.
But I also was struck by how many articles in Freedom flashed on the screen. Articles about all over the world that Hansberry wrote.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'm thinking about is how at this bookshop, they didn't put her anti-colonial writing, which was far more expansive and vast than I had any idea about.
Mm-hmm.
So by not putting that kind of her writing in the case, and the men get to be, so.
Yeah, I'm there with you.
I'm questioning the bookshop owners.
The bookshop owners have to go to the Schomburg and get more. Like, that's what that's about.
But you do
But I'm totally there with you, right?
Yeah, but the way you mention freedom makes me so happy because they don't, of course, they don't go there. They're not going to go there. But so you've answered so many of my questions by putting them together, and I thank you for that.
Sure, no, my pleasure. Thank you. And part of the other thing is that, there's a way in which, especially Fanon now, with the sort of craze around Afro-pessimism, like he's had a sort of revival, and so there's a way in which I think it's necessary to address Fanon directly, especially around the issue of sexuality. When there's a kind of, what can be a kind of idealization of Fanon and of black skin, white mass, by young activists and also, faculty.
I don't question your choice so much as I wish that this chapter would go on and on.
It will, but I can't present on and on.
I think we should all thank Professor Ferguson very much.
Thank you. This has been great. Thank you.